Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Glad to have you on Ask the Experts with LimLoges&Masters. Welcome. I think we're expecting more people, but I'd love to get started. Are you okay with that, Gary?
Yeah, please do.
So just a little bit of housekeeping. You're on mute basically whilst Gary speaks, and he's going to be speaking for about 5 to 10 minutes on microaggressions in the workplace. I love this topic, isn't it? It brings up so much passion in the marketplace. But he'll speak for about 10 minutes, and thereafter we'll move on to the Q&A, and I know that's what you're waiting for. We've had a lot of questions come in as well, so we'll cover those questions as well as invite you to speak online. I know some of you are very camera shy. That's okay with us. You can keep your camera off, but yeah, unmute yourself when we need to. When we go into the presentation, which Gary will give, you are going to be all muted. Sorry for that. All right. Gary, we're starting to get a bit of a crowd now, so shall we get started?
Sure. Thank you, Lilia, for the introduction.
Yeah.
Um,
Before I do that, let me just
mhm.
do tell everybody a little bit about Gary himself. Forgive me. I've just been a little bit naughty over here. So now, this is Gary. You'll find him on our website as well. But Gary possesses over 20 years of experience in gender equality and social inclusion, providing technical advice for the UK's Skills for Prosperity program in 9 countries, and leading both an equality review and strategy development for the British Council in East Asia across 12 countries. So alternating his base between London and Singapore, Gary was previously employed as a director at Advanced Higher Education and Deputy Chief Executive at Equality Challenge Unit in the UK. He has supported education and research bodies such as the Gender Equality Commission of the Swiss National Science Foundation and Coventry University's Centre for Global Learning. And additionally, Gary's academic tenure includes a stint as visiting researcher at the University of Chester's Law School. So we're very, very proud to have Gary with us this session. Thank you so much. And I know it's a very precious 30 minutes. The floor is all yours, Gary.
Thank you for that kind introduction, Lilia. I'm just going to start sharing my slides so that you can see my screen. And hopefully that's on full screen now. Can you all see that? All right, Lilia? Yeah, great. So first of all, thank you, Lilia, and for that kind introduction. And thank you to LimLoges&Masters for organizing this session today. And thank you all for attending the session and taking the time. When Lilia asked me to talk about a topic, she said, pick a topic that you're passionate about and you want to talk about. I thought about how we can make workplaces safer in terms of the psychological safety of staff. And I want to address a specific topic today about microaggressions and how dealing with that can create safer workspaces or psychologically safe workspaces for staff in your firms. So let me start by saying, first of all, what are microaggressions? Death by 1,000 cuts. I love this quotation. That is how microaggressions are described in a 2021 article in Scientific American. The term was actually first coined in 1970 by a US Harvard psychiatrist, Chester M. Pierce, to describe the kind of insult and actions he saw or witnessed against Black Americans by non-Black Americans. And as you can see from the kind of article heading, the author, psychologist Daryl Wing Su, who is an Asian American and an eminent professor in this area, calls these everyday slight and insults and offensive behaviors that people of marginalized groups experience in their daily interactions. And he says, the studies have really shown how they can cause real psychological harm. And these happen in their day-to-day lives, in not just at work, in day-to-day interactions, but I'm going to be focusing here on the work environment. They are often unintentional. Sometimes people think they're often unintentional, but they cause hurt, whether they're intentional or not. And they come from our stereotypes and biases, and that's another whole topic which I can talk about another time. But how does these stereotypes and biases form? And they're also impacted on by societal and cultural norms. And I've put norms in inverted commas here because that's, how culture forms is an interesting part of, workplace culture. So what do I mean by that? So stereotypes, for example, many people will say, X group are more hardworking, or X group are lazier, or X group are more educated and more cultured. And these lead to our biases. So, we might say, oh, we will recruit more of X group because they work harder, and so on. And these stereotypes are influenced by our societal and cultural norms. I'll explain a lot more about this as I go along in my presentation. So, what are some of the microaggressions that people at work may face? Let's look at some of the examples. I'm glad you're so different from them. You are not typically, yeah, ... I actually took this from an article on microaggressions that Filipino professionals face working in Singapore. In fact, in that article, Filipino professional staff talked about their experiences of being told by their managers that they were not typically as loud as other Pinoy workers or other Filipinos, as if there was high praise for being different from their own ethnic group, from their culture. But it was actually an unconscious dig at the culture on what is perceived as a norm or a behavior of a Filipino person. In that same article, others talked about how they were told that their English was very good for a Filipino. A similarly backhanded compliment that, because you come from a certain culture or place, you have a different level of education, and therefore, therefore your English is not as good. I mentioned in my previous slides that microaggressions are often unintentional. And sometimes the people who say these things think they're doing a good thing and complimenting someone. So for example, oh, you are so inspiring overcoming your disability. Now, to a disabled person, this reinforces harmful stereotypes and diminishes their work experience. You wouldn't say to a non-disabled person that they are an inspiration all the time just for going to work, just for performing, their job. So what makes it so different for a disabled person? It reinforces that framing that we value able-bodied people as normal and who can function and work, whereas disabled people are outside of this. And I think, someone else has said it better than me, and I'm going to show you a quote here from an activist and comedian, Stella Young. I want to live in a world where we don't have such low expectations of disabled people, that we are congratulated for getting out of bed and remembering our own names in the morning. And this is her with a comedy thing, and this is the experience she faces all the time, that, she gets congratulated just for being her. And yes, there are inspiring disabled people, just as there are inspiring women, inspiring men, inspiring leaders, but not everybody, is inspiring. Otherwise, the term inspiration would be meaningless. So it can also manifest itself in behaviors. So microaggressions, as I mentioned earlier, come from the stereotype of what we believe as cultural norms. So for example, in almost every culture, we have gendered expectations of how women and men are supposed to behave. And when people don't fall within those norms, they are often subjected to microaggressions. In the West, for example, there is the stereotype of the angry Black woman. This pervasive stereotype characterizes Black women as more hostile, aggressive, overbearing, illogical, and ill-tempered. But if they're made to feel that on a daily basis, they may alter their behaviors and not be authentic at work, and they may hold them back from realizing their full potential in the workplace and sharing ideas. Similarly, in many cultures, one often hears of women who are assertive being described as bossy. If you've worked in Asia, the bossy lady boss is, one of the descriptions that's sometimes used in many kind of that context. Whereas men who are assertive are called good leaders. They're in control of things. They're able to manage their teams. And here we're placing kind of gendered stereotypes and gendered microaggressions against women. Other common examples, especially I suppose in Europe, being asked to shorten your name if it's unpronounceable. I've worked with many Thai colleagues or colleagues from Southern India who are told, I've been told I need to shorten my name in the office because other colleagues say they can't pronounce it. So, they told the manager, can you make my name easier to pronounce? It kind of invalidates someone's experience and their heritage. Or people from certain ethnic groups or genders are asked their opinion more often, or their views are seen as more valid. So in office meetings, for example, you may see people from dominant dominant ethnic cultures, or men being called on more often to speak, and their ideas being taken forward or seen as more valid, often because they're given more airtime by the person who chairs the meeting. So that's where the subtle kind of forms of microaggressions come in. Another common example is assuming that a woman from or a minority, someone from a minority group is more junior. I know a senior, very senior Indian professor who always says to me, I'm a small Asian woman in the UK, and I'm always mistaken for the tea lady. Whenever I go into a meeting, people ask me to make tea, even though I'm the professor in the room. And these kind of common slight kind of really chips away your confidence and being. These microaggressions are more likely to be shown towards people like women, people from minority groups, so LGBT plus people, towards minority races and disabled people. So that's kind of dynamics of how microaggressions work. And why is this important? Because the impact of these things is that these happen often on a daily basis. And the question for many people is, if this happens at work, do I let it go? Or do I confront the person and jeopardize my relationship with that person? In some cases, the person who experiences the microaggressions may experience it from their superiors. And they may choose to let it go because they fear that it jeopardizes their career, so they don't talk about it. But the 1,000 cuts that I mentioned earlier, right at the start, it happens all the time. So it can erode confidence. It makes people stress. It makes people feel that they don't belong in that work environment. It impacts on staff retention as well. People leave because they think, this is not the environment for me. It may conversely make people work harder, but not more productively. They may work harder to burn out because they're trying to prove a point. For example, if you're told that you belong to an ethnic group constantly, that is stereotype as being more lazy, you may work a lot harder, but not more productively. And so actually, it's not great for productivity and staff and team dynamics. Overall, the impact of this can be an impact on staff retention, staff well-being, and this affects team dynamics and kind of how teams function and productivity at work. Why? Because psychological safety is such a big part of offices today. Psychological safety is a term coined by a Harvard Business School professor, Amy Edmondson, in 1999. And it means feeling safe to take interpersonal risks, to speak up, to disagree openly, to kind of surface your concerns without fear or negative repercussions, and to make mistakes. And in the workplace, psychological safety means the belief that among your team members, the people you work with, you can express yourself openly, whether it's about asking questions, sharing ideas, admitting mistakes, or offering feedback without fear that you'll be punished or, in some way. And this, good of psychological safety leads to increased collaboration, innovation, and overall team performance. And all the studies, on kind of team dynamics show this. Because people are encouraged to share creative ideas, and in this kind of environment, people feel safe to think about new ideas, to share new ideas, and it leads to innovation. And like I said, the research shows better psychological safety at work equals better productivity and more effective teams. And that's what we should be striving for in the workplace. So I want to move on to practical things. So what can you do today? I've talked a little bit very briefly, and this is a half-hour session, so I've been very brief and perhaps too quick cantering along. But I've talked very briefly about microaggressions and psychological safety. But what can you take away from today? I'm going to start with the personal, because I think that's the first place one should always start when thinking about these things. And firstly, I would say notice what is going on around you and think about your own behaviors. In work situations, are you unintentionally giving backhanded compliments without realizing? Are your views of certain people at work influenced by stereotypes? What are the team dynamics in your workplace? Are certain people being called on more often to do certain things because of stereotypes? Notice what's going on around you and think about what it might be that's impacting this and what you might change. If the issues of microaggressions are raised or you are challenged, don't be defensive. I think the first thing for many people is, oh, I didn't mean it that way. You know, I'm very defensive. But often when the issue is raised, you know, it can be brushed away, you know, oh, don't be so sensitive, or, oh, I didn't mean it that way. You know, it goes back to the point of intent here. So whether intentional or not, harm has been caused. And where we should all in this situation kind of acknowledge and accept that hurt has been caused. And in the spirit of learning, because I think we're all here learning today, you know, think about the open discussion and learning and continue to listen and learn and be more welcoming of the feedback. But this is the personal, and here we are talking about offices and, you know, and firms and the work environment. So I also want to think about what is it that, you know, your workplace can do to kind of address microaggressions in a kind of large picture of thinking about psychological safety. It's not just about personal learning, it's about organizational culture as well. So some of the interventions I've run and seen work, right in the middle, you'll see, I would always recommend kind of a workplace culture audit. And this is a deep dive into what the culture is like at your firm. It can allow for staff to express their opinions, often anonymously, to understand if microaggressions are impacting them, if there's a culture of openness, if there's strong psychological safety at work. The reason I always recommend an audit is because one size doesn't fit all. Every company has its own culture, its own context, where you are located in the world, whether you're a multinational. And so an audit allows for the right practical interventions to be tailored and put in place. Once that's happened, some of the work I've seen, some of the interventions I've seen work are developing clear codes of conduct on respectful behavior for staff. This allows staff to understand what is expected of them and their behavior at work, helps with, for example, addressing issues on jokey behavior in the office or on the work floor, allows for those who are impacted by microaggressions to be able to raise their concerns within this framework so that there is a structure around it. It also allows us to do some goal setting. You know, if you have some code of conduct, you can see where you want to head to. And it's a good way to kind of think about how staff interact with each other. Depending on the level of knowledge and awareness that exists within firms, and this may come out of the audit, staff development may be an option. It could be a session of specific topics, like one on microaggressions today. It could be a broader session on bias more widely. You could have things added onto it, like bystander training, which is a program where you teach individuals how to recognize issues at work and intervene safely. So, for example, how to call out microaggressions when they're witnessed at work in a kind of safe, non-confrontational manner. Of course, leaders should be learning too, and because they set the tone for organizational culture. So programs that develop inclusive leaders is always a good option. It could include programs that help leaders develop their cultural intelligence, intercultural competence. And again, this depends on the context of where you are, who you work with, who your clients are. I guess still on the topic of leadership development, I think reverse mentoring is something I've put in place and seen work very well. It's a practice where staff from minoritized group mentor more senior colleagues on what it's like to belong to a group and their experiences. I've seen it work particularly well with younger employees whose views on inclusion are often more liberal and open, mentoring senior staff on these perspectives, but both sides getting fresh perspectives on things. And it's a really interesting model to think about how co-learning and co-creation happens in an office environment. Allyship programs, the green box in the left, no, the bottom left, is another option. An allyship program is an initiative which encourages employees, particularly from a majority group, to actively support and advocate for colleagues from marginalized groups. This works really well, actually, coupled with reverse mentoring, because you can actually put the actions you learn from reverse mentoring into an allyship program and advocacy. Finally, one option, creating staff networks. This is about creating spaces in organizations for individuals that share characteristics, for example, disability or sexual orientation, to network and support each other. Some employee networks organize events, learning sessions. They often collaborate with their organizations on policy development. And there are some actually large employee staff networks. So, for example, I know a lot of the banks in Singapore, the global banks, take part in Interbank, which is an LGBTQ plus staff network for their staff network, so that there are kind of support structures for around that. So, you know, it's an interesting model here to think about the different interventions you can put in place. Now, I've talked for much more than the 10 minutes I said I was going to. So I'm going to hand over to you, actually. I want this to be slightly more interactive. So if you have a mobile device or you're on a laptop, you can either scan the QR code with your mobile device, or you can go to slido.com and put in that number there, 182-952. And based on what you've heard today, I just want a quick poll, really. What do you think your firm or team would most benefit from? If you've really had a workplace culture audit, you may say, actually, some of these interventions we should put in place. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to put in your answers. And it'd be interesting to see where staff network, that's the first answer, where you think where you think your firm is at the moment, and what would be useful for you.
So again, if you're having problems with the QR code, go into slido.com and punch in 182-952. Oh, lovely. We've got great responses.
Lilia, we can take questions while people are answering the poll, actually.
Oh,
we,
yeah,
we can leave the
absolutely.
poll. We can leave the poll live. So
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. So let's start off with just some housekeeping rules. I just want to tell everybody that you're all on mute now, and there are reaction buttons at the bottom. So you should see either a smiley face or a heart shape. If you click on the heart shape or the smiley face, you'll be able to raise your hands. And do raise your hands if you have questions for Gary. So that and we will choose whichever question comes first. At that point, please unmute yourself to ask the question and mute yourself back after you've asked the question, please. And if you click on that heart shape again, just to remind everybody, you'll be able to raise your hand. So that's the preferred route. So let me start off with some of the questions that we received when you registered. So this is a great question that came up. Where do I draw the line between a joke under the guise of dark humor and microaggression?
it's an important one, quite a complex one. I think the issue of office banter, office jokes is always, one that people think about. And I think it's important here to consider what I talked about in my slides about intent and impact. So a joke may be intended as harmless, but it kind of reinforces if it reinforces stereotypes or marginalize someone, it kind of crosses into that territory of microaggressions. And actually, we should be thinking more about the impact on people rather than the intent behind the joke. I mentioned as well the kind of cultural and societal norms that kind of permeate office culture, and often it's those norms also reflect societal power. If a joke targets a marginalized group, especially from someone who's telling it from a majority group, it's more likely to be seen as a microaggression because it's just perpetuating, kind of bias from society. And I would think about the context, kind of dark humor or, kind of jokey. Dark humor is between friends can often be seen, as fine. But in a professional setting, you should think about where the sensitivities and boundaries are. In my presentation, I talked about what are the things we can do today is to observe what's going on around you. So if this does happen, and you observe someone expressing discomfort, feeling hurt, or points out that the joke is offensive, then it's crucial to listen to that person. Don't brush it away and say, oh no, they're being oversensitive. It is just a joke. Because humor that kind of makes people excluded or diminished really shouldn't be used in the workplace. So I would draw the line there really on, kind of observing the impact on the people around you.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Again, just to remind everybody, if you want to raise a question live, please raise your hands and we'll come back to you. Alternatively, if you want to use the meeting group chat, you can also type in your questions. So we'll have a look at both platforms. I'll move on to the next question that was sent to us earlier. In the meantime, you can think about your questions that are going to be live. Gary, how is microaggression different in Asia from the West? I will be relocated to Europe in the fall, and I thought this would be very helpful as some guidance.
Okay. I think it's very contextual, and it's quite hard to generalize. I mean, most of the kind of studies on microaggression and kind of academic literature has been published in the West. And it's very hard to generalize the Western Asia. For example, this person asked a question because I don't know anything about you. I don't know, your experiences, where you'll be moving to, but I'll try. I think generally in the West, there has been a longer history of addressing civil rights, slavery, and that shapes how microaggressions have manifested. I talked about the stereotype of the angry Black woman, and that's really come from that kind of social justice, civil rights movement, and that's kind of the views of people and shaped the views of people. But there are other stereotypes too. So let me talk about my example, I suppose. So in the West and many parts of the world, there is a stereotype that East Asian people, so people from East and Southeast Asia, we're the model minority. We work hard, we follow our instructions, we do our job, we don't ask difficult questions. And so we're the kind of model minority that's just quiet, sits in the corner, does our work. But we're not natural leaders, apparently. We're not natural leaders. So there is surprise expressed if you see an East Asian leader, and you don't see many East Asian leaders in industry in the West. We're also lumped together as East Asians or Southeast Asians. There's no distinction between us. So my culture and background is sometimes erased. So the example I gave on Filipino workers in Singapore, for example, are these professional workers in Singapore? It wouldn't hold because we're seen as one homogenous kind of grouping. We're just people from East Asia. Whereas I think in Asia, the microaggressions may be more focused on, I talked there about race in terms of the angry Black woman trope. I think the microaggressions may be more focused on social economic factors in Asia. So assumptions on what cultures are more traditional, more progressive, which countries are richer, in Asia. And I suppose the example I gave on Filipinos in Singapore relates to that supposed hierarchy between different Asian people. But that's not a subtle area that comes out when you're in the West because we're seen as one monolithic block. I also think when it comes to addressing microaggressions, people in the West are probably more direct. I think there's been a longer history of talking about it. And in Asia, this could be because of the kind of concept of saving face. Or it could be that Asia tends to be more hierarchical in the societal structure, so people are less willing to raise these issues. So I suppose for someone moving from Asia to the West, a really interesting one for this person is, and I don't know what ethnicity you are and where you're from, is that you could be being transplanted from a country where you are in the majority to being in the minority. So actually, your experiences will be minoritized, and it will impact on the kinds of microaggressions you see. But it really depends on your personal context, because I don't know anything about this person.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gary. We've got another interesting question, and this is, what are your thoughts on diversity in a Muslim country and company? Muslim-owned, I suppose it means Muslim-owned company.
Hard question. I have done some gender work in the Middle East, which is interesting because it's, there are certain. Actually, no. Let me start this out again. I think I would start first of all. It's important to not generalize. Muslim countries, I guess, vary in terms of their degree of religious observance. The plurality of the people, and I talked about gender earlier, and doing some gender work in the Middle East, is the kind of gendered roles and expectations are different for different Muslim countries. So we mustn't fall into that trap of thinking that a Muslim country or a Muslim-owned company will be more traditional, will be more conservative. If you look at doing work in Saudi Arabia as compared to Malaysia, they are very different. The kinds of things you may offer are very different. I would start by saying, actually, you must think about that. They're not monolithic because they're only built on stereotypes, and like I said earlier, not all East Asian people are the same, not all Muslim people are the same, and not one monolithic block. But I would start by thinking, actually, the thoughts on diversity in a Muslim country is that you have to make sure that your safety or your staff safety is there. So think about the laws of each country and the jurisdiction of each country first, because you don't want, for example, to be starting an LGBT plus network in your firm if it outs people, because it's not safe for them. So that would be my starting point. Think about the laws in each country. But when it comes to challenging microaggressions, I would use the same non-confrontational techniques. This would mean, if possible, having one-to-one private discussions. If a microaggression is raised towards you, express how it affected you rather than blaming someone or using accusatory language. So instead of saying, "Oh, why did you say that?" It's more about, "Can I ask you something? When you said X, it made me feel X because of X." So explain what it made to you. I think the concept of faith, like I mentioned earlier, is really important here. So try and position feedback as information rather than criticism. But I actually think some of the interventions I mentioned earlier, like reverse mentoring, allyship, can be really important. They can help foster learning between different people and groups. So you could, for example, build a program on reverse mentoring and allyship where non-Muslims learn about Islamic practices and their microaggressions that many Muslims face around the world when they travel. You talk about racial profiling in the US, that happens a lot with people from the Middle East, for example. And that can be reflected back to the situation of what it's like to be a non-Muslim living and working in this environment and other issues that could surface around gender or sexual orientation. But like I said, always in a safe manner, because you must consider the laws of each country and protect the well-being of your employees.
Yes, yeah, that's a great reminder. Thank you, Gary. We've got a live question from Peter. Peter, would you like to unmute yourself and ask Gary your question?
Yeah, hi, Gary. Really interesting stuff. I was just wondering, in what ways can addressing these microaggressions lead to improved team creativity and innovation and things like that?
Thanks, Peter. And it's a great question. I mentioned in my kind of presentation that people perform better when they are in psychologically safe workspaces. So there is a lot of work about authentic leadership, authentic cultures at work. And if you're comfortable at being yourself at work, then you're more comfortable sharing things with colleagues and more comfortable sharing ideas. And that leads to creativity and innovation. You get better staff retention, so you have increased diversity of thought. And actually, without that diversity of thought, we potentially lose markets without realizing. So an example is, I'm wearing my Fitbit now. I don't know if you can see it. It's bright pink on screen. Yeah, and I'm going to talk about Fitbits, and I know you're probably thinking, what on earth am I talking about? But actually, first and second generation Fitbit were not designed with diversity of thought. And there is a heart rate monitor behind my Fitbit, which penetrates the skin and it reads, I don't know how it works, but the capillaries and vein dilation to talk about heart rate. But they didn't test it, and I don't know whether because there was no diversity, but they didn't test it on Black people in the US. So it doesn't work on Black skin. The light sensors are not deep enough to penetrate the skin. And so they lost a market share there. Black people say, well, I'm not going to buy this because it doesn't work for me. It can't read my heart rate. I'm going to go to a competitor brand. But actually, if you had diversity of thought in a room and thought, actually, would it work for me? We talk about, classic examples, we talk about seat belts and safety. Most all seat belts were designed to test on male crash test dummies. They didn't test the safety on women. There was no women crash test dummies. So seat belts were not safe for women early on. And you lose market share. You think people are going to want to buy things that work for them. So what you want is diversity of thought in the room and actually creating psychological safety by addressing the kind of microaggressions at work will give you that better staff retention and better thoughts and innovation.
Yeah, I hope that helped, Peter. I know we're pushing the time limit a little bit. Shall we take one last question, Gary? And that is, how might a manager's assumption that a female employee is less capable of leading a project based solely on her gender affect the team dynamics and the employee's confidence?
Wow, okay. That's an interesting question. I would say making assumptions based solely on someone's gender is obviously dangerous. That veers into the implicit bias bit, which is the starting point for where a lot of microaggressions come from. So, we're biased because we think a woman, in this case, is less capable, less able to do things. That's very dangerous territory. It affects employee confidence, absolutely, because if she's being told all the time that she's not good enough to lead a team, then it's going to affect her confidence greatly. It may affect team dynamic. She may see, for example, in this situation, a man being promoted ahead of her, even though she may think that man is not good enough, and other people may think actually that man is not as good as her. Why is he being promoted? And it takes it chips away at one's confidence, and it chips away at one's ability to work. I'm going to use a personal example, and I'm not going to name these people because I don't want. I have a family member who is relatively young, and she's decided to become an MP. And if anybody knows the Singapore parliamentary system, she's doing grassroots work for the ruling party, basically. And she's relatively young, and she started to do grassroots. Not that she started to do, she's done grassroots work for many years, but she's been thrust into the limelight recently as a potential MP. And there have been horrible comments about her on social media about, oh, look, they've parachuted yet another young woman in because they're running out of young women to be MPs. And it's really chipped away at her confidence. Nobody's questioned her. Nobody said, well, actually, she has a really strong track record on X, which she does. She has a good academic record, a good, professional record, but nobody's talking about that. They've made assumptions based on how she looks and and her gender, and it's damaging. It's damaging her confidence, and it's damaging to the team around her that's working around her to say, actually, you are a good person. You should be an MP if you are elected. So, making these assumptions are dangerous. And actually, this is a whole session on implicit bias, which maybe I should run another session on implicit bias and how to mitigate that.
Yes, yes. We've got everybody responding to your poll, and I am very happy to see that they've chosen workplace culture audit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually Lilia's going to have a last slide at the end with kind of contact details. But if these are things that you feel like you want to discuss with Lilia and with me, please do drop us a line, because these are things that we can develop with you as well.
Yeah, sorry, I was sharing the wrong screen over there.
I need to stop share that, actually, so Lilia can share her screen.
Okay, thank you. All right, this is just for you to take note of. We have, my name is Lilia, just to remind everybody, I'm with LimLoges&Masters, and we work with companies on their issues around people or their ideas around people. So we're always interested in hearing what people are doing right now and how they're working through these huge changes that we're seeing in the marketplace. Trust and belonging are becoming very, very critical in the workplace. We hope you will continue to join us in our next session. We've got another 3 more sessions for our Ask Our Experts sessions. And on the 2nd of October, we've got Jean-Sébastien Lemay talking about, can AI replace everyone? I think that's a really hot topic right now. On the 16th, we've got Pia talking about social impact. What does that mean? And how do you measure it in the workplace? And on the 29th of October, we've got Robert talking about Scope 3 emissions, and for all the environmental passionate mentors out there, please come join us. Join us for the next event. My email is provided below, and website is provided. Please join us on LinkedIn as well. And if you have any further questions for Gary, please let us know. We'd love to come back to you, and if necessary, if there's enough of an interest, we'd love to develop a whole new workshop just for you. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone. Thanks for joining in. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.